Hey, welcome back to the channel, everybody. I'll be showing you how I built this crosscut sled. I used 3/4 inch plywood for the sled base and 1/4 inch plywood for the sled runners. If you like this workbench that you see here, I've got a video posted. You can click on the link up in the right hand corner if you want to know more about that workbench. So I started by cutting down the 1/4 inch plywood to a more manageable piece so that I could start cutting the runners. Once I measured the channel width, I adjusted the fence and cut a test piece. And it was a little bit too wide, so I narrowed the fence and did another test piece. And once I was happy with it, cut two runners to obviously longer than I needed. And you may have to do this a couple of times. You want the runners to be snug, but not so snug that they don't glide freely in those channels. So you may have to do it a couple of times before you get it right, but it's critical. Next, I cut the sled base to size 30 inches by 15 inches. And if you don't have a track saw, that edge guide, which I got from Harbor Freight from maybe $8, works really good. So next we're ready to start thinking about attaching the runners to the sled base. And you want those runners to be in the channel but not bottoming out on the channel. So you need to use some shims to lift it up off the bottom of that channel. And I had these 1/2 inch nuts that I used, which wound up being perfect. And then you also want that 1/4 inch plywood to be just proud of the tabletop so that when you put the sled base on to glue, the base is just coming in contact with the runners and not the tabletop. And you'll see what I'm talking about here in a minute when I put one of the runners on. So you can see with the runner in place that it's sitting just proud of the top of the table saw, which is perfect. So next I put the runners in the channels, and you want to make sure that you've got shims directly underneath the front and back. You don't want it dipping into the channel at the front and back. Just want to it steady and even front to back so that you get a very good glue bond. So I wound up putting the sled base right in the middle. I split the difference so the saw blade is right in the middle. You can move it left or right depending on what you want to use it for. If you have some longer pieces you think you'll be cutting, you can adjust it so you've got more space for a stop block on one side or the other. But for this fence, I put it right down the middle. So once you're happy with where you want it, just clamp down the table saw fence so that you have a reference to square up the sled to the runners. And then you glue the runners to the base and clamp it down and ensure that that edge up against the fence is up against the fence so that it's square to the runners. And you're clamping it down essentially with just weight. So I put a couple of paint cans and two saws on there to weight it down, clamp it down, let that dry for a few hours. So once it's dry, I took the weight off and flipped the fence over to check the glue bond, and it was great front to back. So I was ready to move on. If you want to take the extra step and countersink some screws in there, you can do that, but the bond was very good, so I didn't feel like I needed to do that. So then obviously you need to remove whatever you used for shims, put the sled on the table saw, and make sure that it's still gliding freely before you move on. So if you're happy with the way it's moving at this point, you can trim off the excess runner. And then it's time to build the front and rear fences for the sled. So back to the 3/4 inch plywood, and I ripped three pieces at 30 inches long by 2.5 inches. and I'll be connecting 2 of the 3/4 inch plywood pieces together for the front fence, and then just 1 piece will be used for the rear fence. So next I glued the 2 pieces together. That'll be the front fence, and clamp them in place to dry. Once they were dry, I removed the clamps and just ran one of the edges through the table saw to clean up that side that's going to come in contact with the base of the sled. And now we're ready to attach the fences, so you can put the base into the table saw channels and run it in about halfway. And the rear fence you do want to glue down, but I took the time to square it up. You really don't have to, because you're not using that fence as a reference to make your cuts. But I did, so it doesn't need to be square, but I did anyway, and you can glue it down and then attach some screws for stability, and obviously countersink those so they're not binding on the table saw top. So once you've done that, you can run the sled through the table saw, through the back of that fence, and then just slide it forward. And I stopped about 3 inches short of the front, and I'll be putting on the front fence next. So there's that double 3/4 inch plywood for the front fence, and just using a speed square to square it. Doesn't need to be exact at this point. And once you're happy with the general location, you can make a pencil mark just for reference. And then I snugged up a clamp on the one end once I was happy with the location. Not using glue on the front fence in case adjustments need to be made down the road. So once you're happy with that one side, you can tighten that clamp down and then countersink and drive a screw home on that one side. And that's sort of being used as a pivot point. So same thing, you're going to be squaring up the fence and then just snugging a clamp onto the other side so that you have some ability to make some micro adjustments. And once you're happy that the fence is square to the saw blade, you can tighten down the clamp on the other side and repeat the process of countersinking and driving a screw home. So then you'll have the 2 ends secure. Then you can pull the fence forward off the front of the table saw and drive in 2 more countersunk screws closer to the middle on either side of the saw blade for extra stability. And that's what I'm doing here now. So you can see as I push the fence forward, the blade comes out the front, so I decided it would be a good idea to add a safety feature of just putting a few blocks, just as basically a reminder to keep your fingers or thumbs away from that area in the event that the blade does come through the front. So just glued those 3 blocks together in place and clamped them down, and just drove in 1 countersunk screw as a clamp, basically. So next I took some silicone spray to clean out the channels, and then also to give it some slickness so that the sled base would glide a lot easier. I'll be following up with this with some paste wax, and you can put the paste wax on the runners and then the entire bottom of the sled base, and that'll make it even more slick. But the silicone worked really well. But I would follow it up with the paste wax. So next I decided that I'd continue the channels of the table saw onto the workbench top so that I could run the sled past the end of the table saw onto the workbench if I needed to, if I was cutting some thicker material like 2x4s. So I just clamped a piece of plywood onto the bench top as a straight edge essentially, and went down one side, moved it forward to do the other side, and that was the first channel, and then repeated the process on the other side. And went in about 4 inches, but it wasn't exact, it doesn't need to be. But you can see now that the sled has plenty of room to slide onto the workbench top. So I just made a few test cuts and put a stop block in place and made a few more cuts. It's a nice little sled, simple to build, and as always, I appreciate you watching. If you have any questions, leave a comment. And again, if you want to know how I built this workbench, you can click the description. I'll put it up in the right hand corner here as well. So thanks again for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.